But let's begin this morning with the major turning point in the criminal trial of former President Donald Trump. Jury deliberations are set to begin today. This follows a marathon day of closing arguments. Prosecutors accuse Trump of falsifying business records to cover up a payment made to adult film actor Stormy Daniels. Trump has pleaded not guilty to all the charges.
Our Errol Barnett is outside the courthouse following all the latest developments. All right, Errol, I know throughout this whole thing we've been saying that this is historic, but I mean, it really is historic. We're talking about a former president. Now a jury is going to be determining that president's future. What's the process for jury deliberations?
Hey there, Anne-Marie. Good morning to you. Well, in just about 30 minutes from now, the jury will be assembled in the courtroom with the judge and the defendant, former President Trump, and Judge Merchan will walk through what the law is and how the jury should apply the law to determining if the 34 felony counts against Trump are something that he is guilty of beyond a reasonable doubt or not. It's really as simple as that. Now, because each side last week went through a process in which the script the judge will read from was edited. Each side had to determine the language. I mean, that's how detailed this process is. So Judge Merchan this morning will effectively be reading from an agreed-upon script, telling the jury what the law is and how to apply it to each of the 34 felony counts against Trump. So that could take a number of hours, but as soon as that's done, Anne-Marie, it's then all up to these 12 New Yorkers who will go behind closed doors as they speak to each other and negotiate and hash this case out with one another to determine on each of these counts if Donald Trump is guilty or not.
Well, I'm sure they were somewhat relieved to get a good night's sleep before this portion of the trial continues, because yesterday the closing arguments went on forever. I mean, in 5 hours and 2.5 hours or something like that? What were the points they were making over that period of time?
Yeah, Anne-Marie, they didn't leave the courthouse behind me until after 8 p.m. last night. And that's mostly because the prosecution took up the vast majority of the day laying out a sweeping narrative. And it was interesting to see the difference in closing arguments. Todd Blanche for Donald Trump was defending him by being very narrow and saying Michael Cohen, the key star witness that's the glue between the allegations and Trump's instruction to carry all this out, Blanche said Cohen cannot be trusted. He's a liar. There's inconsistencies in his testimony. And that's really all that Todd Blanche did in a very dramatic way in front of the jury. But Joshua Steinglass for the state, for the prosecution, then took a different approach for most of yesterday, all of yesterday afternoon. He had a sweeping narrative that this is election interference because Cohen, Trump, and David Pecker decided in Trump Tower in the summer of 2015 to mislead the American public by suppressing negative stories, by catching and killing them, so that Trump could become president and win the White House. And Steinglass went on to explain that after he won the White House, that's when you had these crimes take place, because he falsified checks to Cohen that reimbursed him for the hush money, says the prosecution, when in reality Trump wrote that they were retainers for legal fees. So the prosecution played video clips, audio clips. They showed text messages, call logs, and they even had kind of a slideshow PowerPoint presentation to prove that narrative. And that's one reason why it went so long. And another thing, Anne-Marie, the prosecution said during that marathon closing argument was, you can listen back to this footage anytime you like. You can look back at this page. And so he was actually giving the jury a bit of instruction during closing arguments of where to come back to in what you could consider an open note test that they'll be taking today as they determine innocence or guilt on behalf of Donald Trump.
Well, I love that you described it that way because, you know, if it was any other person in any other circumstances, this would just be a case about paperwork, really. But we're talking about a former president, somebody who wants to be the future president. And, you know, it is elevated now to a felony, but it's a little complicated. Can you just remind us, you know, specifically what the president is being charged with?
That's right. You know, the issue is that this is commonly referred to as the hush money trial, and the most salacious piece of it is this former pornographic actress alleging an affair with Donald Trump. But that's not really what's being litigated. What's being litigated as far as the charges against Trump is falsifying business records, which is a Class E felony in New York, so long as those business records are being falsified in furthering another crime. So the jury has to see a link between those two. That other crime is a New York state law in which you cannot pursue office through unlawful means. And the prosecution made the case that by paying a tabloid to catch and kill negative stories so that American voters wouldn't be able to determine for themselves whether or not they care was the crime. And so paying off Stormy Daniels wasn't necessarily the issue, but repaying Michael Cohen and saying their legal fees when actually Trump was reimbursing him for the initial hush money payment is the crime for a political candidate who is seeking office. And so that's the two-part question the jury has to answer on these 34 felony counts. Did Donald Trump falsify the records? Yes or no? And did he do that in the furtherance of another crime? Yes or no? And was that other crime pursuing office while misleading voters and suppressing information? The prosecution said the payment to the tabloid and Michael Cohen's payment to Stormy Daniels admitted to campaign finance fraud, because those aren't the types of financial behaviors permitted under election law.
Yeah, and just the fact that it took you that long to explain it lets you know, like, this is pretty complicated. And you were concise, actually. Errol, thank you very much.